Do you ever get that feeling like the world is just teetering right on the brink, maybe between total crisis and, I don't know, some kind of real transformation? It feels like these ancient stories are subtly playing out, on the nightly news. And it leaves you with way more questions than answers about what's really going on. If you sense there's maybe a deeper story unfolding just beneath the headlines, well, you're definitely not alone in that. So, okay, let's unpack this a bit. Our mission today really is to try and cut through some of that noise, some of the confusion. We're taking a deep dive into this ebook called The Last Age of War, the First Age of Peace, Lord Kalki, Prophecies, and the Path to Global Redemption. Now, this isn't about us telling you what to believe, not at all. It's more about giving you the tools, maybe, to understand a really profound and honestly quite surprising perspective on where humanity might be standing right now. This deep dive, we hope, gives us all a bit of a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about something a lot of people are talking about, but maybe few truly grasp.
You know, how ancient wisdom might actually connect directly to today's geopolitical hotspots, offering this, well, startling vision for global peace.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how this particular source tries to synthesize so many different things, diverse religious prophecies, current events. It draws them together to create this kind of roadmap, and that roadmap is, well, it's both startlingly insightful and perhaps also deeply hopeful. It's a really bold attempt to connect the dots, between things that seem totally separate global events and this much older, deeper narrative about human civilization and its cycles.
It certainly sounds bold. Okay, so let's jump right into it. The source calls this point we're at the global boiling point, how geopolitics and prophecy seem to be converging, especially in one very specific and, let's face it, perpetually volatile region. Right. The source basically drops us immediately into the heart of all the current global anxiety, the Middle East. It describes the region as the spiritual axis of the planet, which is quite a phrase, a crucible of civilization, culture, and conflict.
So it's not just geography.
No, not at all. It's presented as something much more profound, spiritually significant, a place where millennia of, well, spiritual yearning, conquests, revelations, resurrections, all that stuff has left this indelible mark. And today, it really feels like it's teetering on a precipice, doesn't it? Not just maybe for a regional war, but potentially something far, far bigger.
Indeed. The very first chapter lays out in pretty stark detail the escalating tensions, particularly between Iran and Israel. Now, they don't share a direct border, obviously, but their strategic engagements, they're becoming increasingly hostile. The source really highlights Iran's extensive support for various proxy groups. Think of these as non-state armed actors like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and various militias scattered across Syria and Iraq. These groups often act almost like extensions of Iran's regional influence, and they're directly challenging Israeli interests. It creates this constant state of sort of low-level conflict that frankly could erupt at any moment.
And Israel's responses, they're equally direct, aren't they? How does the source frame those?
Oh, absolutely. They are direct. The source details Israel's regular airstrikes, for instance, on Iranian assets and infrastructure, particularly in Syria. But beyond conventional military actions, there's also this significant shadow war going on. We're talking cyber warfare, covert operations, even assassinations of nuclear scientists alongside these maritime confrontations playing out in the Red Sea. It's this continuous kind of undeclared conflict that could easily escalate. And a major point of contention, of course, is Iran's uranium enrichment program. Israel views that as a genuine existential threat, given how close it seems to be getting to weaponization thresholds.
Right. And when it comes to diplomacy, well, it sounds like the source doesn't exactly paint a rosy picture there either.
No, unfortunately, that's accurate. The source points pretty clearly to the failure of various international efforts. Things like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, and numerous mediation attempts by European countries, Gulf states. Dialogue has really faltered, and a key reason is that both Iran and Israel genuinely seem to believe they're acting purely in self-preservation. That mutual conviction, well, it just contributes to this growing sense that a military confrontation isn't just possible, it's looking increasingly likely.
So it's definitely not just a two-player game. It's more like a regional powder keg with lots of actors involved. Does the source shed light on how the alliances are shifting in that area?
It does, yeah. The Iran-Israel conflict is deeply embedded within this much broader landscape of shifting alliances and rising tensions. Our source notes Iran's increasing alignment with Russia and China, for example. That's a strategic move, really, to try and get around U.S.-led sanctions and global isolation. And conversely, Israel has significantly deepened its ties with several Arab states through the Abraham Accords. You remember those normalization agreements signed back in 2020 between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco?
A huge shift.
A profound realignment, exactly.
Right.
It's transforming historical enemies into allies, and maybe some old allies into new adversaries. The whole region is actively reconfiguring itself. The lines of conflict and cooperation are just being dramatically redrawn right now.
It really sounds like a complex geopolitical chessboard. But the source also keeps emphasizing something beyond just politics, right? This spiritual, symbolic centrality of the Middle East, calling it the spiritual axis of the planet, the birthplace of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Yes, exactly. And right at the very heart of this spiritual axis, you find Jerusalem, a city that's sacred to all three Abrahamic religions. For Jews, it's the site of the ancient temple, absolutely central to their worship and national identity. For Christians, well, it's the city where Christ was crucified and resurrected. And for Muslims, it's the location of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the site of Prophet Muhammad's night journey. So the religious magnetism of Jerusalem isn't just historical, it's deeply eschatological. That means each faith sees the city playing a crucial role in, well, the end of days. This makes political control over Jerusalem far more than just about sovereignty. For many, it's seen as a matter of salvation, of destiny itself.
And within Jerusalem, there's that one specific plot of land that always seems to be the ultimate flashpoint, the Temple Mount.
Absolutely. Our source actually calls it the most contested real estate in the world, and it covers just a mere 35 acres. It houses the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, Islam's third holiest sites. But crucially, it's also the site of the first and second Jewish temples. That makes it absolutely central to Jewish messianic expectations. For almost 2,000 years, Jews have prayed for the rebuilding of the temple, and the rising calls we hear now from some segments of Israeli society to actually construct the third temple, well, they aren't just nationalistic ambitions. For some, they are apocalyptic. Certain prophecies suggest the rebuilding would actually usher in the messianic age. The inherent problem, of course, is the existing Islamic holy sites right there, which are administered by the Islamic Waqf, a religious trust. This makes reconstruction almost impossible without triggering massive conflict.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. How ancient prophecy isn't just theory anymore. It's becoming front and center in today's geopolitical talk, specifically with something called the Red Heifer. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a biblical epic, but our source says it's a very modern, very urgent issue. How does something so ancient suddenly become so incredibly relevant and even volatile in today's world?
It is astonishing, isn't it, how literal some interpretations are becoming. The red heifer, or para aduma in Hebrew, originates from the book of Numbers in the Hebrew Bible. It states that the ashes of a flawless red cow, which has to be burned outside the camp, are necessary for ritual purification, particularly for people who've come into contact with death. This purification is considered absolutely essential for temple worship. And it's actually one of the most mysterious commandments in the Torah, often considered a divine decree with, frankly, no clear rational explanation. But the point is, without this ritual purification, no priest, no Israelite, no worship could be considered acceptable on the Temple Mount, according to that tradition.
Wow. And this isn't just some dusty old idea. The source describes it as a very modern quest, right? People are actually looking for this.
That's exactly right. In recent years, temple-focused groups in Israel, particularly those aligned with the Temple Institute, have been actively pursuing this. They've actually imported red heifers from the United States, from Texas, I believe, and bred them in the Galilee region. Back in 2022, 5 such calves were brought to Israel under really tight scrutiny, and the videos of their arrival, well, they stirred up both huge excitement among some and real fear among others globally. For those who seek the rebuilding of the temple, the appearance of a genuinely pure red heifer signals divine readiness. They argue that the last ritual obstacle to constructing the third temple has now been removed.
But for many in the Muslim world.
Exactly. For many within the Muslim world, this isn't seen as a sign of sanctity at all. It's seen as a sign of imminent sacrilege, a direct threat to their holy sites.
So this seemingly obscure biblical ritual has now become, as our source puts it, prophecy as political theater. It's almost unbelievable how directly this stuff connects to current headlines.
It truly is. The red heifer has completely transcended its original religious symbolism. It's become a significant political statement. Its very appearance generates major headlines, diplomatic warnings, even outright threats of war. It just highlights this unique, potent fusion of religion, prophecy, and politics that characterizes the modern Middle East, where a ritual from thousands of years ago can now genuinely set the stage for major regional upheaval.
And this obviously connects directly to the broader Third Temple movement itself, doesn't it?
Precisely. At the very core of this movement to rebuild the temple is the Temple Institute. It's a religious organization based in Jerusalem, and they've spent decades meticulously recreating temple vessels, priestly garments, architectural plans, everything needed. And these aren't just historical artifacts sitting in a museum. They're functional items, prepared for immediate use the moment they believe the temple can be reconstructed. This movement is also closely linked with religious Zionism, which is a segment of Israeli society that views the modern state of Israel as basically the first step towards messianic redemption. For them, reclaiming the Temple Mount is absolutely central to their spiritual mission.
So it's not just some fringe idea then. It has real and apparently growing political ambitions behind it.
Correct. While the official Israeli government policies to maintain the status quo on the Temple Mount, allowing Muslims administrative control through the Islamic Walker, there are members of the Knesset, Israel's parliament, and various far-right activists who consistently advocate for increased Jewish access and prayer rights there. Things like these highly publicized Temple Mount ascensions by Jewish politicians, open calls for rebuilding the temple, social media campaigns celebrating the Red Heifer's arrival. They've all deeply alarmed the Muslim world, understandably. These actions, even when framed in secular or legalistic language, carry undeniable spiritual undertones. And the source highlights that what might have once been a fringe movement has actually gained considerable traction, especially among Israeli youth, nationalist circles, and interestingly, global evangelical Christian networks. There are even polls showing increasing support within Israel for Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. So this normalization of temple discourse is transforming what was once maybe a millenarian dream into a concrete political project that carries significant religious legitimacy for its supporters.
Which, understandably, generates a very strong response from the Muslim world. Our source frames this clearly. Al-Aqsa as a red line.
Yes, the sanctity of the Al-Aqsa Mosque for Muslims is absolute. It's the third holiest site in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. It's believed to be the place from which Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heavens during his night journey. So, any perceived threat to it galvanizes Muslims globally. The source reminds us that past rumors or attempts to tamper with the mosque have triggered violent uprisings going back to the 1929 riots and more recently the Second Intifada, which began in 2000. Even seemingly small shifts in the status quo, like installing metal detectors at the entrances or Israeli police entering the compound, can become major flashpoints.
And it seems like this specific threat has a unique power to unite otherwise disparate groups within the Muslim world.
It really does. The threat to Al-Aqsa uniquely unifies the Muslim Ummah, that's the term for the global Muslim community, which transcends national or sectarian divides. You'll see Shia and Sunni, Arab and non-Arab, conservative and secular factions often finding common cause when it comes to defending the mosque's sanctity. Leaders like Iran's supreme leader or Turkey's President Erdogan regularly speak of its defense as a kind of divine duty. The source stresses that any credible move to actually destroy or replace Al-Aqsa could trigger a massive Islamic backlash, carrying a theological and emotional weight that's truly incalculable.
And this also has a profound eschatological dimension for Muslims too, right? Tied into their own end times beliefs.
Yes, absolutely. Islamic eschatology includes its own signs of the end times. Things like the appearance of the Mahdi, the descent of Jesus or Isa, as he's known in Islam, and final battles between truth and falsehood. The desecration of holy places, particularly Al-Aqsa, is seen in some interpretations as a definite sign that the last hour is near. So for many in the Muslim world, moves towards building a third temple aren't just political acts. They're seen as cosmic provocations, disturbing the divine order itself.
It's an incredibly complex picture. And then Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity, plays this surprising, almost paradoxical role in the whole situation.
It's a critical and very complex dynamic. In large parts of the evangelical Christian world, particularly in the United States, there's a specific theological viewpoint. It sees the return of Jews to Israel, the eventual rebuilding of the temple, and even the coming of the Antichrist as sequential steps in fulfilling biblical prophecy. This theology, often known as dispensationalism, which basically divides biblical history into distinct periods or dispensations, paradoxically leads to strong support for the Jewish temple. Not really for its own sake, but because it's seen as a necessary precursor to Christ's second coming. And this theological support translates into very real things. Billions of dollars in donations to Israeli organizations, and robust political advocacy in Washington, D.C. It makes evangelical lobbies among the most influential pro-Israel groups in shaping U.S. foreign policy.
So it's a significant alliance, definitely, even if the theology underpinning it is one that as the source notes, some people find uncomfortable.
Absolutely. The source points out that this specific theology posits an end-time scenario where Jewish people will suffer greatly during a period called the tribulation and only achieve salvation by converting to Christianity when Christ returns. Many Jews are, quite understandably, uncomfortable with this particular flavor of support. Nevertheless, this alliance between certain messianic Jewish groups and Christian Zionists is a powerful and often misunderstood driver of temple-oriented activism. It's important to note, though, that not all Christians agree with these interpretations. The Vatican, the World Council of Churches, many mainline Protestant and Orthodox groups, they generally oppose efforts to disturb the Temple Mount's status quo. But their voices are often overshadowed by the more apocalyptic Christian narratives in the media and politics.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together. We have ancient prophecies being literally interpreted today. We have modern geopolitics converging intensely on this tiny plot of land in Jerusalem. And it feels like we have all the ingredients for a truly global crisis. The source really puts the question out there: is prophecy a script that has to be performed, or is that a warning we're supposed to heed?
That's the absolute crucial question the source poses right at this juncture. It asks whether prophecy is self-fulfilling or if it's actually self-preventing. Is it a warning, a call for repentance, for humility, for transformation? Or is it just a script that has to be played out no matter the human cost? The source argues quite strongly that prophecy isn't fatalism. Humanity has agency, leaders have responsibility, the faithful have choices they can make. The Red Heifer doesn't automatically trigger anything unless people make it a trigger. The Temple Mount doesn't have to be a battlefield unless we allow it to become one. Rebuilding the temple or preserving Al-Aqsa, these things don't have to lead to war. But, and this is the key point, if they're approached with absolute certainty, without compassion, without wisdom, then they very well might. And this is where the source introduces the idea of Lord Kalki offering a kind of third path. Not destruction, not domination, but transcendence. His Kalkiist Manifesto, it claims, lays out how prophecy can potentially be fulfilled in peace, not war. He doesn't call for temples built by demolishing others, the source says, but for temples of truth, compassion, and justice built within the hearts of all humanity.
Wow. It's quite a different perspective. It sounds like we're at this moment where ancient scripture is meeting modern geopolitics with potentially explosive real-world consequences. The Red Heifer has arrived, the plans for the temple are drawn up, and the fears of billions of Muslims are palpable. The world's eyes really are fixed on Jerusalem. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. When we hear end times, I think most of us immediately picture those Hollywood blockbusters, right? Meteors crashing, zombies, global devastation. But our source argues pretty strongly that this is a profound misunderstanding, that this common, often fear-driven interpretation actually distorts the real essence of ancient prophecies.
Yes, this is a really critical point that Chapter 3 tackles head-on. Modern popular culture, definitely fueled by Hollywood and sensationalist headlines, has absolutely propagated this idea that end times equals global catastrophe. You know, asteroid impacts, zombie outbreaks, nuclear holocaust. And while that framing might provoke a sense of urgency, it also breeds this really dangerous fatalism. If the world is ending anyway, why bother trying to fix anything? Why try to make peace if war is supposedly part of the prophecy? The source explicitly calls this mindset self-destructive. It turns sacred teachings into scripts of doom, and maybe worse, justifies inaction when urgent action is precisely what's needed.
And it seems like some strands of religious fundamentalism even embrace this apocalyptic view with a kind of eagerness, almost a lust for judgment, as the source puts it.
Yes, the source does point that out, that certain religious groups seem to embrace the end times with a kind of eagerness. They might see divine judgment as vengeance against non-believers, or the immoral, or simply the other. In that view, God's wrath is almost welcomed, and violence can even be sanctified as part of the plan. However, the source argues this is a complete perversion of the divine. True prophecy, it insists, calls not for destruction, but for purification, not for annihilation, but for awakening.
So if it's not the literal end of the world as we know it, what does end times actually mean according to these religious traditions? It sounds like the source suggests a much more nuanced concept, maybe focused on ages instead.
Exactly. The source makes a clear distinction. It clarifies that end times signifies the end of an age, not the planet's annihilation. It's more about an epoch, a period characterized by spiritual degradation, moral confusion, and material excess coming to a close. It introduces the Hindu concept, the doctrine of yugas. This describes time as cyclical, moving through 4 ages. Satya Yuga, which is the golden age of truth and righteousness. Then Treta Yuga, where virtue starts to decline a bit. The Dvapara Yuga, where morality is roughly halved. And finally, Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is considered the darkest phase, a time of moral collapse, spiritual ignorance, and widespread confusion. And the source argues we are currently living deep within the Kali Yuga. But the crucial point is, even this age isn't eternal. It must, and it will, eventually give way to a new cycle, the start of a new Satya Yuga.
Okay, interesting. And it seems the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, also share this kind of concept of ages or transitions, even if the terminology is different.
They do, yes. In Christianity, for instance, the New Testament often refers to the end of the age, not explicitly the end of the world. You see this in Matthew 28:20. It signifies a transition into what's called the kingdom of God. Similarly, Islam understands world history culminating in a day of judgment, but this also leads to a purified new world characterized by divine justice and peace. So both traditions point towards continuity after a transition rather than total destruction. Really, all these traditions, whether you look through the lens of yugas or messianic time or divine judgment, they all point to a cycle where something ends, yes, but something greater begins. The end times are framed not as a death sentence for the planet, but more like a death sentence for ignorance, injustice, and illusion. And our source then goes into quite vivid detail about the characteristics of this Kali Yuga that it claims we're living in now. It talks about a pervasive moral collapse where greed dominates, power is valued way above compassion, and truth gets distorted, often replaced by outright propaganda. It describes spiritual confusion, where religions maybe lose their core essence, rituals replace genuine meaning, and the divine message itself gets commercialized, politicized, even weaponized. We also see, it argues, a profound material obsession where consumption replaces contemplation and spiritual values are often mocked in favor of accumulating wealth and seeking pleasure. And finally, there's this deep fragmentation of unity, nations fracturing, communities dividing, tribalism, nationalism, ideological extremism running rampant, causing the fundamental oneness of humanity to be forgotten. All these signs, the source argues, are abundantly clear in the modern world. It confirms the Kali Yuga is here, but insists its end is also written. And crucially, its conclusion doesn't have to be some fiery explosion. It could be an awakening.
Okay, so the real apocalypse, then, isn't a meteor strike after all. It's something much more profound, maybe more internal, a lifting of the veil, as the source puts it.
Yes, exactly. The source puts it quite provocatively. The real apocalypse is not a meteor strike. It is a lifting of the veil. The original Greek word apocalypsis actually means revelation or disclosure rather than destruction. So it's about truth being revealed, masks falling away, systems built on lies finally collapsing, which, while undoubtedly painful, is presented as necessary for growth. And this leads to another really bold assertion in the book, the end of religion as we know it. The source suggests that current institutional religions, because they are largely products of the Kali Yuga themselves, may not actually survive this transition, that they might make way for something else, a universal spirituality based on direct experience and inner transformation.
Wow. Okay. And this transition, this lifting of the veil, leads eventually to the birth of the Satya Yuga, this new age of truth.
Exactly. The coming Satya Yuga is described as being characterized by harmony with nature, governance based on wisdom rather than just wealth or power, the dissolution of borders leading towards planetary unity, true education focused on potential, shared abundance, and a direct, unmediated connection to the divine for everyone. The source really emphasizes that this isn't just some far-off utopian dream. It's described as a design of the universe that actually requires humanity's active participation to manifest. Prophecy, then, in this context, gets reframed. It's not just about prediction, it's a warning and a kind of moral map, a call to conscious action. And Lord Kalki's role in this transition is presented as being primarily illuminating rather than punishing, marking the transition through revelation, ideally, rather than through bloodshed.
This really does change the whole narrative, doesn't it? It shifts it away from a terrifying, inevitable end towards something much more like a hopeful new beginning. But crucially, one that asks for our active involvement. The end isn't the end of the earth. It's the end of an illusion, the end of a dark age, the end of false idols, making way for something potentially glorious. Right now, our source really pushes back quite powerfully against that common feeling, that sense many of us have, that major global conflict is somehow inevitable. It asks us to seriously consider if maybe we're just misreading the script. It suggests that this looming conflict everyone talks about isn't a necessity at all, but actually a profound choice we face.
Yes, this is a crucial pivot in the source material, moving into Chapter 4. It directly tackles this illusion of inevitability. Many people, including religious believers, tend to misinterpret apocalyptic prophecies. from the Book of Daniel, Revelation, parts of the Quran, the Hindu Puranas. They see them as these rigid, ironclad timelines, assuming war and destruction must unfold exactly as described. But the source counters this strongly. It argues that prophecy is primarily a warning, not a prediction set in stone. It's conditional. It lays out a possible future, often a negative one, precisely so that it can be avoided, not so that it has to be embraced. It uses the biblical example of Jonah warning the city of Nineveh about impending destruction. But destruction was averted because the people listened, they changed their ways, they repented. That story underscores the point perfectly. Prophecies describing destruction are often calls to action, calls to change course, not celebrations of impending doom.
So it's not really about fate then. It's much more about free will being at play. That's actually quite a powerful idea to hold on to, especially in turbulent times like these.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it applies on the geopolitical stage, too. Leaders often talk about unavoidable confrontation, right? They invoke history or deterrence theory to justify massive arms buildups and aggressive posturing. But the source calls this kind of thinking resignation, not realism. True realism, it argues, should be adaptive. It should seek to manage risks creatively rather than simply escalate them. This fatalism gets reinforced by media narratives too, which often thrive on conflict, polarization, good versus evil stories. And that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, effectively closing the door to imaginative, peaceful alternatives. Yet the source insists, behind all the headlines, millions and millions of ordinary people genuinely long for peace. And their voices, even though they're rarely amplified, they still matter.
That reminds me, history is actually full of moments, isn't it, where the world stood right on the brink of catastrophe but somehow managed to pull back. Does our source give us some compelling examples of these kinds of averted conflicts?
It does, yes. It offers some powerful historical precedents for wars that were avoided against the odds. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is highlighted naturally. That was a moment when the U.S. and the Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than ever before, or perhaps since. Yet catastrophe was averted? How? Through things like back-channel diplomacy, mutual restraint, and a willingness to seek face-saving compromise. Kennedy and Khrushchev ultimately chose survival over a potentially Pyrrhic victory, preserving the future. Another really compelling case study is South Africa's largely peaceful transition from apartheid. I mean, despite decades of armed resistance and a brutal state apparatus, a combination of moral leadership, truth commissions, international pressure, it allowed for a transition where figures like Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk chose peace over an almost certain civil war. It wasn't easy, not by any stretch, but it proved what courage and forgiveness can achieve. And even nuclear rivals like India and Pakistan have repeatedly pulled back from the brink, for instance, after the Kargil conflict or the Mumbai attacks. It demonstrates that dialogue can prevent catastrophe, even when there's deep-seated mistrust.
Okay, so if these incredibly tense situations in the past were avoided, what about today's looming war clouds? Can we still pull back from the brink now?
The source is very clear that yes, we absolutely can. But it also doesn't shy away from identifying the gravest current threats. The possibility of direct conflict between Iran and Israel, for instance, remains one of the most serious global dangers, especially if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, or if Israel perceives it's just about to. When you add Hezbollah, Syria, the Gulf states into that mix, the whole region looks like a powder keg ready to ignite. Yet even here, the source emphasizes that off-ramps exist. Things like backdoor diplomacy, regional security guarantees, maybe mutually verified non-aggression pacts, de-escalation zones. The Abraham Accords themselves are cited as proof of what's possible, suggesting more peace treaties could potentially follow if the will is there. Another major flashpoint discussed is the escalating tension between the U.S., China, and Taiwan. A conflict there, the source warns, would be utterly catastrophic for the global economy and stability. It calls urgently for thoughtful statesmanship, strategic patience, and regional diplomacy to maintain peace across the Taiwan Strait. And then there's the ongoing war in Ukraine involving Russia and NATO. While devastating, the source states it need not metastasize into world war, but avoiding that requires compromise, humility, and likely some painful concessions from all sides. The challenge, it suggests, is to expand our collective imagination to envision a post-war Europe that somehow includes both Russia and Ukraine in a sustainable peace system.
And beyond the purely geopolitical calculations, our source also touches on the profound spiritual cost of war. It reminds us very bluntly, war is not glory.
Yes, it really challenges that romanticized view of war head-on. War isn't glorious, it argues, it's devastation. It means orphaned children, bombed cities, shattered futures. The spiritual cost is enormous. It breaks the human spirit, fostering these cycles of hatred and trauma that can last for generations. From a dharmic perspective, which means looking at it based on cosmic law or right conduct, war generates vast amounts of collective karma. The suffering it creates just reverberates across time and space. Empires built on blood, it reminds us, ultimately do not endure, and every missile fired carries a spiritual consequence. Ultimately, the source argues, war delays enlightenment. If we destroy the earth or each other, how can we possibly enter the Satya Yuga or fulfill prophecy in a positive way? Violence is not a path to God, it states flatly. It is a detour into darkness. Peace is the real path of the divine. And then, importantly, the source lays out some real alternatives. It starts with envisioning a multipolar peace architecture, one that balances power not just through arms, but through mutual interests, shared technology, and cultural respect. It points to organizations like BRICS, ASEAN, the African Union as potential contributors to a new kind of global dialogue, moving beyond old power blocks. It also envisions a fundamental shift towards a peace economy, moving away from war-based industries, things like arms sales, surveillance tech, towards economic systems built on renewable energy, universal education and healthcare, and maybe even using AI in service of creating abundance rather than just profit or control.
And then connecting back, it introduces this transformative Kalkiist path.
Yes, the Kalkiist path is presented explicitly as a blueprint for peace without violence. It calls for some really radical changes: a cashless, interest-free economy, a new global constitution rooted in justice and compassion, the idea of planetary citizenship, a transformation of governance from being about power to being about wisdom. It also emphasizes spiritual literacy alongside scientific curiosity, describing this path not as just a dream but as a practical roadmap. But crucially, a roadmap which must be walked together.
This raises a really important question, doesn't it? If these alternatives are real, and if history even shows us ways to avoid conflict, why aren't we taking them? And maybe more personally, what role do you, our listener, play in choosing a different path? The source seems very clear. War isn't inevitable, it's avoidable. But only if we act, if we awaken. Okay, so for millennia, literally millions, maybe billions of people have prayed the words, "Thy kingdom come," on earth as it is in heaven. It's incredibly familiar. But what if our source is actually right? What if the kingdom isn't just something we wait for, but it's already here, or at least quietly manifesting around us? That's such a radical idea, challenging the common perception.
It is indeed. Chapter 6 makes this bold suggestion that this ancient prayer, probably one of the most widely recited phrases in human history, might have already been answered, or is at least in the process of being answered right now. The source delves into Jesus's quite radical vision of the kingdom. He described it not in political terms, not with palaces or armies, but as something quiet, almost hidden, yet incredibly powerful, like a tiny mustard seed growing into a huge tree, or leaven working unseen through dough, or a hidden treasure found in a field, or a pearl of great price worth selling everything for. He said it was at hand and even within people. That was a revolutionary concept at the time, challenging the common Jewish expectation of a political messiah who would restore national sovereignty. And the phrase, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," gets interpreted here not as a call to escape earth and go to heaven, but as a call to actively transform earth, to align human society with divine values like justice, mercy, and service. This turns the Lord's Prayer into less of a petition and more of a mission statement for humanity.
Interesting. And it seems this vision of a kingdom, or maybe a golden age, isn't exclusive to Christianity, is it? The source highlights similar concepts across other major world traditions as well.
That's absolutely right. The source draws clear parallels. In Hindu cosmology, for example, the Satya Yuga, the Age of Truth, is presented as the divine equivalent of the kingdom of God. It's a time of perfect alignment with Dharma, cosmic law, and righteousness, and it's ushered in, according to prophecy, by Lord Kalki. In Mahayana Buddhism, you have the concept of a pure land, a realm where suffering is absent and enlightenment is much more easily attainable. But importantly, it's also seen as a state of mind that can be cultivated in this world, echoing the Bodhisattva vow, that commitment to attain enlightenment not just for oneself, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. And in Islam, the coming of the Mahdi and the return of Isa, Jesus, are linked to a future time of global justice, transforming Earth into a society ruled by mercy, equity, and unity. So, across all these diverse traditions, the pattern seems consistent. The ultimate goal isn't an escape from Earth, but rather its restoration, its transformation into something reflecting the divine.
Okay, so if that's the vision, are there any compelling signs, according to the source, that this kingdom, this transformation has already begun to arrive? Maybe not in some dramatic flash of light, but perhaps more subtly?
Our source definitely suggests there are compelling signs, yes, if we adjust our perspective and know where to look. For instance, technologies now exist that allow for unprecedented global cooperation and communication. The poorest person today might have access to more knowledge than kings did just a few centuries ago. Old empires, old ways of thinking are visibly crumbling. People everywhere are reclaiming their sovereignty, demanding change. Spiritual teachings from different traditions are converging, cross-pollinating, revealing a kind of universal underlying truth. Ancient prophecies, the source argues, are being fulfilled perhaps not through bloodshed and catastrophe, as often imagined, but through a profound, spreading awakening of consciousness. The kingdom, in this view, doesn't arrive with banners and swords. It arrives with insight, compassion, and the courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to build a better world. It's already being built, piece by piece.
And the Kalkiist Manifesto, which we discussed earlier, is presented within this context as a kind of kingdom charter. What exactly does that mean here?
Yes, it's framed almost like a new covenant for this emerging age, a covenant focused on planetary justice, borderless cooperation, and widespread spiritual literacy. It functions as a practical blueprint for manifesting kingdom consciousness within society itself. It calls for an end to things like financial enslavement, demands universal access to basic needs, advocates for a transition from materialism towards meaning, and proposes a spiritual literacy movement to awaken the masses from the slumber of the Kali Yuga. Lord Kalki himself is introduced here as the Messiah as kingdom catalyst, a figure who, the source claims, doesn't seek worship but rather understanding, and who invites all of humanity to co-create this kingdom on earth. The kingdom, the source emphasizes, isn't something imposed from above, it's invited into being through humanity's conscious choices and actions, requiring us to embody divinity, shifting from being passive consumers to active citizens of a transformed world.
Okay, this is where the source makes a truly paradigm-shifting, maybe even provocative claim. What if the Jewish Messiah, the Christian Christ figure returning, the Islamic Mahdi and Isa, and the Hindu Lord Kalki, what if they're all just different names, different cultural expressions for the same prophesied figure? I mean, that challenges so many deeply held beliefs about distinct religious traditions.
This is indeed the core. Might have actually been waiting for the same individual all along, just described through their own unique cultural and theological lenses. The source starts by exploring the traditional Jewish expectation of the Messiah, often envisioned as a fully human king, descended from the line of King David. This figure is expected to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, gather the Jewish exiles back to Israel, restore Jewish sovereignty, and usher in a global age of peace and knowledge of God. It briefly explains why, from this perspective, Jesus was rejected by many Jews at the time, because he didn't fulfill these specific, very tangible criteria. He didn't rebuild the temple, didn't bring world peace, the world remained broken after his death, and he didn't conform to expectations of Jewish law or kingship in the way they anticipated. But then the source raises the provocative question. What if the Davidic prophecy was fulfilled in Jesus, as Christians claim, and now the world awaits not another descendant of David, but a global redeemer, someone who completes the mission of spiritual transformation and establishes tangible, worldly justice for everyone?
Right, and for Christians, the primary expectation is the second coming of Christ, often envisioned as a very literal, very dramatic return from the heavens.
That's correct. Christians generally believe Jesus will return physically to defeat evil, judge the nations, and establish the kingdom of God fully on earth. Descriptions in the New Testament, particularly in Revelation, paint a picture of a glorious, sudden, and cosmic return. However, the source challenges what it calls an overly literal interpretation of these prophecies. It questions if his return might not be a physical, bodily reappearance, but perhaps a spiritual continuation. It asks, could the Christ Spirit, sometimes referred to as the Logos, the divine reason and word, return through a new human manifestation? Someone carrying the same essential divine consciousness, but speaking to a new world in a new voice, addressing today's specific global challenges. Could Lord Kalki then be seen as the continuation of the Christ mission, adapted for a globalized, multi-faith, post-industrial age? It really forces Christians, the source suggests, to consider the possibility of recognizing their Lord in a new robe, perhaps under a different name.
And then the Islamic expectation, which centers on two figures, the Mahdi and the return of Isa, or Jesus. How does that fit in?
In Islamic eschatology, the Mahdi is a divinely guided leader who is expected to appear before the Day of Judgment. His role is to lead Muslims back to true justice, defeat the Dajjal, often seen as the Antichrist figure or false messiah, unite the global Muslim community, the Ummah, and establish equity across the world. Isa, Jesus, is expected to descend alongside the Mahdi. His role is primarily to affirm pure monotheism, the absolute oneness of God, and, as prophecy states, to break the cross, which is often interpreted as correcting certain Christian theological interpretations and affirming that God alone is divine. While tradition generally maintains a distinction between Mahdi and Isa, some Islamic scholars have suggested a kind of unity of mission, if not necessarily personhood. The source picks up on this, asking if their complementary roles could potentially be spiritually fused or embodied in a single final world redeemer. Islamic prophecy also speaks of the end of Islam, not in the sense of failure, but completion, where the Mahdi fulfills the ultimate purpose of all prior divine revelations, guiding humanity finally to unity and justice under God. In this sense, the source suggests Lord Kalki may not belong to Islam, but he might be the figure through whom Islam achieves its ultimate destiny.
Fascinating. And then we come full circle back to the Hindu avatar, Lord Kalki.
Yes. Hindu scriptures, particularly the Puranas, prophesy that at the very end of the current Dark Age, the Kali Yuga, Lord Vishnu, the preserver aspect of the divine, will incarnate for the 10th and final time as Kalki. He's often depicted riding a white horse, wielding a blazing sword, his mission being to destroy adharma, unrighteousness, uproot corruption, awaken dormant souls, and usher in the next golden age, the Satya Yuga. Unlike earlier avatars who came at different points, Kalki appears when spiritual ignorance and corruption are supposedly at their absolute peak. This indicates his task is one of total transformation, perhaps, rather than just gentle guidance. And crucially, the sword Kalki wields is widely interpreted, especially in modern commentary, not as a literal weapon for bloodshed, but as the symbolic sword of truth or sword of knowledge. Its purpose is to slice through lies, through systems of exploitation, through spiritual darkness and illusion. It's about destroying illusion, not people, leading a revolution primarily of consciousness. The source then poses the question very directly, is Lord Kalki already here? It prompts the reader, you listening, to consider if this figure has perhaps already spoken, already written, already declared the path forward. Can his identity be verified, not through miracles necessarily, but through fulfilled prophecies and lived wisdom? Has his manifesto, the roadmap, already been published? This leads to the powerful conclusion presented in the book. Maybe these are not competing messiahs at all. It's possible, the source argues, even likely, that the Jewish Messiah, the Christian Christ returning, the Islamic Mahdi and Isa, the Hindu Kalki avatar, perhaps even the Buddhist Maitreya, the future Buddha, and concepts like the Great Spirit in indigenous traditions, maybe they're all just cultural lenses onto a singular cosmic event, the return or arrival of the world teacher.
Wow. That's a huge idea. But if this is true, if it's the same figure awaited by so many, why isn't it widely recognized? Why isn't the whole world celebrating this convergence?
Yeah, that's the tough question. And the source addresses what it calls the painful reality of rejection. It points out that historically, divine figures from Jesus to Muhammad to the Buddha were often rejected, ridiculed, or persecuted, precisely because their truth threatened existing power structures, political, religious, and economic. So it argues, it stands to reason, that Lord Kalki would also likely be ignored, denied, or mocked, even by those who claim to await him, because he comes to shatter expectations, not to conform to pre-existing, often rigid ideas. He doesn't come to wear the crown humanity made for him, but to embody a truth we often refuse to see. He doesn't belong to any single religion, the source claims, but completes them all. The conclusion then becomes a powerful call to action. Stop waiting. Start recognizing. A Messiah isn't just coming anymore. Perhaps he is already here, not as a king or a warrior in the old sense, but as a truth teller, a redeemer, a guide, and the builder of the next world, a world intended for all humanity.
The implications of that are just truly profound. The idea that humanity has collectively been waiting for the same figure all along, and that figure, Lord Kalki, according to this source, is already here, offering a specific path forward. Which brings us naturally to the specifics of that path itself.
Right, and Chapter 8 then really deepens the understanding of who Kalki is supposed to be and what his mission entails, according to this perspective. The source highlights that prophecies from texts like the Bhagavata Purana, the Vishnu Purana, the Agni Purana, even the Mahabharata, describe Kalki riding a white horse, wielding a sword, restoring righteousness. And the signs of his arrival described in these texts seem to mirror our current times. Widespread corruption, global unrest, pervasive hypocrisy, misuse of technology, and this deep underlying longing for spiritual guidance across many nations. If these are indeed the signs, the source asks pointedly, is there really any doubt the time is now? It clarifies the nature of Kalki as a human being divinely commissioned, not presented as some supernatural being descending from the clouds, but born of human parents, though his consciousness is described as divine. He walks among humanity not to dazzle with miracles, but simply to reveal truth. His sword of knowledge is described metaphorically as his word, his voice, his teachings, which are meant to dismantle lies, injustice, and corruption at their root. The greatest revelation is not military. It is consciousness, the source states, and Kalki is presented as the leader of this consciousness revolution. His identity, it suggests, is revealed by the fruit of his mission. Does he speak to all humanity beyond religious or national divides? Does his message seem to fulfill prophecies from multiple faiths? Does he challenge unjust systems while consistently offering a peaceful path forward? Has he actually written the roadmap? The Kalkiist Manifesto is presented here as his definitive declaration. What makes Lord Kalki unique, the source argues, is that he isn't trying to start yet another new religion. Instead, his aim is presented as helping to end the Kali Yuga religions, meaning to unite their core truths while helping humanity discard the accumulated corruption, dogma, and division. So he's presented not just as a Hindu savior figure, but as the world redeemer. He also offers a radical socioeconomic revolution aimed squarely against things like interest-based debt, political corruption, corporate exploitation, religious manipulation, systemic inequality, and manufactured scarcity. He's described almost as a reluctant leader, someone called to this immense role, not actively seeking followers or power, but aiming instead to awaken the divine potential within others. The source also anticipates, or perhaps describes, the likely reactions to Kalki. Religious authorities, it predicts, will largely deny him because he threatens their intermediary power and offers a direct connection to God, bypassing institutional structures. Secular powers, politicians, bankers, media empires will tend to ridicule or ignore him, dismissing his message as dangerously naive or impractical. However, the awakened, those who suffer under the current systems, those genuinely seeking truth, those who feel intuitively that the world is fundamentally wrong, they will recognize him. Not necessarily through miracles or dogma, but through the simple resonance of truth in his words. This recognition, then, leads directly to the Kalkiist Manifesto as the practical path forward. It's offered as a roadmap for the next stage, effectively a constitution for the Satya Yuga, outlining a peaceful, rational, and deeply spiritual plan for global transformation, calling for collective participation in the birth of this new age.
The idea that humanity has been waiting for the same figure, and that figure, Lord Kalki, is here offering this path. It's astounding. It leads us straight to the specifics of that path, the Kalkiist Manifesto.
Yes, and the source highlights that almost every major revolution in history begins with a document, right? Ideas written down that shape an age. Think of the Magna Carta, the U.S. Constitution, even the Communist Manifesto. However, it asserts that none of these past documents really go far enough to address the unique, complex, interconnected crises of today's world. Things like climate change, religious conflict, runaway capitalism, digital exploitation, a pervasive sense of spiritual emptiness. What's needed now, the source argues, isn't just reform of the existing systems, it's reinvention. A total systems reboot, economic, spiritual, political, ecological. And the Kalkiist Manifesto, purportedly penned by Lord Kalki himself, is presented as exactly that reset. A blueprint for humanity's next age. A bridge to transition from the darkness of the Kali Yuga to the light of the Satya Yuga.
Okay, imagine this. A world with no money, no national borders, and where technology only serves human flourishing. I mean, it sounds like pure fantasy, doesn't it? But our source insists this isn't just a dream. It's the only practical blueprint for humanity's next chapter. Let's try to unpack the radical simplicity of the Kalkiist Manifesto's core pillars.
Okay, the first core pillar described is a cashless, interest-free economy. This calls for the complete abolition of money as we know it, and the practice of charging interest. The argument is that money inherently concentrates power and enables manipulation, while interest enslaves both nations and individuals in inescapable debt cycles. Markets, it argues, end up reducing human life itself to just units of profit. In the proposed New Age, basic needs, food, housing, education, healthcare, would be freely available to everyone. Labor wouldn't be something you have to do for survival, but would be offered as service, motivated by joy or purpose. Technology, particularly AI and clean energy, would be harnessed to automate scarcity away, making universal abundance genuinely possible. And the source is very explicit. This is not communism or capitalism. It is liberation from the monetary mind. It's framed as a complete redefinition of value itself. The second pillar is the end of nation-states. This envisions a future of planetary citizenship. No passports, no national armies, no wars fought over borders, just one human species sharing one home. Decisions would still be made, but perhaps more locally and globally rather than being trapped at the national level. Governance itself would become decentralized, transparent, and administered, ideally, by those who have demonstrated proven ethics and wisdom. Next, a post-religious spiritual civilization is proposed. This doesn't mean atheism, but rather a shift towards direct spiritual experience, replacing reliance on institutional religions. It involves fostering meditation and inner realization over external rituals and dogmas. It promotes a universal ethic based on compassion, truth, and justice. All previous spiritual messengers are honored, but no single figure is worshipped exclusively, and crucially, there are no chosen people, because the divine is understood to live equally within every single person. The fourth pillar introduces a new educational paradigm. This moves way beyond standardized tests and rote learning to focus on awakening each individual's unique potential. Schools would teach things like emotional intelligence, ecological harmony, spiritual literacy, creative problem solving, and a sense of both civic and cosmic responsibility. The goal isn't conditioning children for the existing economy, but nurturing them to be wise custodians of the earth and visionaries for the future. And finally, the manifesto advocates strongly for the marriage of science and spirituality, rejecting the false dichotomy, the supposed war between them. Science would be ethically guided, used primarily for healing and understanding. Spirituality itself would be investigated rigorously, the mysteries of consciousness mapped. New technologies like AI, biotechnology, quantum computing are seen as potentially part of the divine plan, but only the source stresses if governed by dharma, not profit. How does this get implemented? Well, the path outline starts simply with awareness. The manifesto itself needs to be read, understood, debated, translated into every language, maybe read in school, shared widely online and offline. It's not meant to be imposed on anyone, but designed to resonate with those who recognize its truth, awakening a dormant understanding. It advocates for a peaceful revolution, not violent overthrow. The emphasis is on changing minds and building networks, not using guns or force. This could involve things like workers peacefully walking out of exploitative industries, citizens demanding local assemblies for direct democracy, engineers collaborating to build alternative systems based on these principles, artists using their creativity to reshape culture towards unity and truth. Change, the source insists, spreads from below. The manifesto also envisions using global digital platforms for transition. Things like developing a global open source constitution, creating planetary data commons for shared knowledge, building digital governance platforms for transparent decision making, perhaps even using AI assistants programmed for ethical guidance, and leveraging VRR for immersive learning and healing. Many of these tools, the source notes, are actually already emerging in today's tech landscape. And who can join this movement? The answer given is everyone. It's explicitly stated that this is not a cult, not a political party, not some secret society. It's open to absolutely anyone, anywhere, who genuinely seeks truth, rejects injustice, honors life, and wants to work towards unity. There's no formal initiation process. The initiation is simply an awakening to the truth and taking action, however small. A special role for youth is specifically highlighted. Young people are seen as potential torchbearers, often less burdened by old dogmas, more open to innovation. They are called upon to lead things like youth parliaments, digital awareness campaigns, community cooperatives, interfaith dialogue assemblies. They are described poetically as the midwives of Satya Yuga. And lastly, it's a clear call from readers to builders. Just reading the manifesto isn't enough. It must be lived. This means actively building Kalkiist-inspired communities, teaching its principles, perhaps adapting careers towards service, and consciously decolonizing mind from money, fear, separation. The message is stark. The age of spectators is over. This is the age of co-creators. What's the ultimate promise here? The promise of redemption, according to the source, is not about waiting for salvation from above, but participation on earth. Lord Kalki, it says, calls us to save ourselves together. He offers the roadmap, not demanding worship, but illuminating the path to manifesting heaven on earth here and now. This would lead, potentially, to a civilization beyond fear. No more fear of starvation, homelessness, war, or even fear of a judgmental God. Instead, a planetary culture rooted in love, cooperation, justice, and joy. Guided by truth, mutual trust, and the inherent thrill of conscious evolution. The manifesto itself is presented as a potential legacy text, something future generations might look back on as the founding document of an age of peace, truth, and global awakening. But, the source warns, only if we act now.
That is a truly radical, almost breathtaking vision for our shared future. But it's one that our source insists isn't just a pipe dream, but a practical, achievable plan. The scale of the transformation proposed is immense, absolutely, but the message seems crystal clear. The path to peace is here, it is structured, and it demands our active participation, starting right now. Okay, but this leads to maybe the most unsettling question the book raises. If this path to peace, this roadmap laid out in the manifesto, is supposedly so clear and compelling, why isn't the world clamoring for it? Why, as our source puts it, is there generally a deafening silence surrounding it?
Yeah, this is perhaps the most challenging, maybe even confronting question the source addresses, primarily in Chapter 10. It points directly to this profound paradox. The path to peace might exist, clearly articulated, but the world seems profoundly unwilling to walk it. The first explanation offered is what it terms an addiction to conflict. Humans, the source argues, are creatures of habit, even when those habits are painful or destructive. War, division, tribalism, these aren't just political realities. They become deeply ingrained psychological identities. Peace, in contrast, can feel alien, unfamiliar, even vaguely dangerous because it requires letting go of those identities. It talks about intergenerational trauma, filtering our perception, making suspicion feel like safety, and aggression seem like necessary self-defense. Hope for real change is often met with deep-seated doubt or cynicism, and those currently in power, whether in empires or religious hierarchies, often resist peace fundamentally because true peace requires equity, humility, a willingness to step off the throne. So they cling to conflict, consciously or unconsciously, out of a fear of losing power and control.
So it's suggesting war isn't just a conflict, it's almost like a business model for some. That's a truly cynical, but maybe disturbingly realistic perspective.
Absolutely. The source pulls no punches on this. It describes what it calls an industrial complex of war and religion. It states bluntly that war is big business, pointing to the global arms trade exceeding, what, $2 trillion annually? Defense contractors, security firms, even some media outlets arguably profit immensely from conflict, ensuring war is perpetually engineered and monetized. The Kalkiist proposal for disarmament and a peace economy directly threatens these entire powerful industries. So naturally, they might work to suppress the message, often through subtle means like silence and distraction, rather than overt censorship. Organized religion, too, is implicated in this critique. While most religions claim to pray for peace, the source argues many institutions actually thrive on division, maintaining boundaries between true believers and heretics, hoarding wealth, sometimes even sanctifying suffering. The Kalkiist call to end religious control, to move towards direct spiritual experience, is deeply threatening to their authority and financial structures. This leads them, the source claims, to either ignore the message entirely or label it as blasphemy. Silence as strategy is presented as a key tactic here. The greatest enemy of transformation, the source asserts, isn't necessarily violence, it's erasure by apathy, where a potentially world-changing message is simply pretended out of existence.
Wow. And the masses, ordinary people. We ourselves seem to play a role in this silence too, almost a kind of collective complacency, as the source describes it.
They do, yes. The source laments what it calls the failure of the masses, describing modern society largely as a spectator society. Most people, it argues, are passive observers scrolling through news feeds, liking posts, maybe commenting angrily but not actually acting, building alternatives, or taking personal risks for change. This passivity, it suggests, is partly a product of the modern world, which often trains us towards dependence on experts, leaders, institutions. The Kalkiist message, in contrast, demands self-responsibility, initiative, courage, which can feel overwhelming to a population often feeling numbed by information overload, economic pressure, and a sense of powerlessness. People are also incredibly distracted and divided. Social media algorithms often fragment reality, trapping us in echo chambers, fueling outrage but rarely channeling it effectively. Tribal politics, left-right, nationalist, religious, actively reject the kind of universal identity that Kalkiism proposes, sometimes accusing it of trying to erase culture. And there's also just a fundamental lack of vision. Most people alive today have literally never experienced a world without war, poverty, or deep religious division. They simply lack the imagination, the source argues, to truly conceive of the world described in the Kalkiist Manifesto. So they dismiss it, maybe politely, saying, well, it sounds nice, but it will never happen. Why is the manifesto specifically ignored? The source suggests a few reasons. One, it is too radical, yet too practical. It offers such a fundamental systemic transformation that it threatens almost everyone's established worldview: liberals, conservatives, reformists, revolutionaries. It offers a kind of structured rebirth, a middle path that most political or economic ideologies haven't been trained to even conceive of. Two, it doesn't fit the narrative. Media thrives on conflict, on binaries, on heroes and villains. Kalkiism attempts to transcend these, making it unclassifiable and therefore difficult to report on within standard frames. And perhaps the deepest, most uncomfortable truth the source offers is that maybe, just maybe, people are not ready to be free. True freedom, it argues, requires immense responsibility, moral maturity, the willingness to let go of egoic attachments and victim mentalities. The manifesto promises awakening, and awakening can be painful. It demands the end of comfortable illusions and easy excuses. Until people are truly willing to face themselves, the source suggests, they will likely continue to ignore the voice calling them towards a higher, freer state. The cost of ignoring the message is presented as dire. If the path to peace is willfully ignored, then the war will come, not as fate, but as a direct result of human folly and inertia. But even then, the kingdom will still arrive, with or without you. Meaning the evolutionary process of history, the shift towards a new age, will move forward regardless of whether individuals or groups choose to participate consciously. This current moment of silence, therefore, is presented as a last chance, a critical juncture, a test, a stillness that could precede either a devastating storm or a beautiful new song for humanity.
That is a powerful indictment, isn't it? It really forces us, maybe forces you listening, to ask, am I part of this deafening silence? And what will the ultimate cost be if we collectively don't find a way to break it? The source seems to be urging us urgently to break that silence, to speak up, read, debate, share, organize, awaken, before the silence potentially turns to screams. Okay, but despite all that resistance, despite the deafening silence we just discussed, our source consistently maintains that the Satya Yuga, this coming age of truth, isn't just some fantasy. It's presented as a real and actually achievable future for humanity. So what does that age truly entail? What does it look like? And maybe most importantly, how do we prepare ourselves for it, starting now?
Right. Chapter 11 lays out this positive vision in quite compelling detail. It reiterates that the Satya Yuga is considered the first and purest age in the Hindu cosmological cycle. It's seen as the natural state of humanity, the way things are meant to be. It's characterized by qualities like perfect truthfulness, Satya means truth, universal dharma, meaning righteous conduct, aligned with cosmic law, deep harmony with nature, pervasive spiritual awareness in everyone, genuine peace, shared abundance, and even greater longevity. It's emphasized that this is a golden age, not of wealth, but of wisdom. It's explicitly framed not as some utopian fairy tale, but as a real, achievable social order, one that is born from humanity's collective ascent into living by principles of truth and service. The Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, is seen as breathing its final breaths, and the Satya Yuga is born from our collective choice to embody and live by these higher principles.
Okay, so what are the specific characteristics of this Satya Yuga civilization? What does it actually look like in practice? How does it fundamentally differ from the Kali Yuga we're supposedly in now?
The source outlines several key characteristics that paint a picture. First, truth is the foundation. This means a fundamental alignment between thought, word, and deed becomes the norm. Leaders literally cannot lie and retain their position. Teachers live what they teach. Science and spirituality work together, not in conflict, because truth is experienced as self-evident. This is obviously a stark contrast to the Kali Yuga, where deception is often rampant. Second, spiritual awareness is universal. Everyone is primarily considered a soul, having a human experience. Meditation and self-reflection are basic life skills. Children are taught to observe their thoughts. Elders are respected for their clarity and wisdom. Religious division essentially ceases because the divine isn't seen as separate or belonging to one group. It's about achieving spiritual literacy for all. This replaces the fragmented, often dogmatic spirituality common in our current age. Third, technology in service of Dharma. This means technology is liberated from purely profit-driven motives. AI is governed by spiritual intelligence and ethics. Energy becomes free and clean for everyone. Machines are used primarily to eliminate suffering and drudgery. VR and AR might be used for profound learning and healing experiences. Every new innovation is rigorously tested by its ethical impact on well-being and the planet, moving far beyond just marking potential. Then there are economies of sharing. Money, as we understand it today, effectively disappears. Basic needs, food, shelter, healthcare, education, are met unconditionally for all. Labor is offered freely, out of joy or a sense of purpose, not coerced by the need for survival. Ownership shifts towards stewardship. We care for resources rather than possess them. No one is desperately poor, and no one is obscenely rich. Everyone contributes according to ability and receives according to need. This is fundamentally different from today's world of massive inequality. And lastly, governance by the wise. Power naturally flows to those who are ethically awakened, not just the loudest, wealthiest, or most cunning. Leaders are selected based on demonstrated virtue and vision. Decision-making becomes highly localized, participatory, and transparent, likely aided by technology. Justice focuses on restoration and healing, not just punishment. The whole goal of governance shifts from control towards maintaining balance and fostering well-being for all.
Wow. Okay, that's a compelling vision. So how do we prepare ourselves for this? How do we join in this piece, this transition? It sounds like it has to start internally, almost like a personal revolution first.
It absolutely does. The very first step outlined is inner cleansing. This means consciously shedding the residues, the habits of mind from the Kali Yuga. Things like pervasive fear, envy, the addiction to opinions and being right, status obsession, tribal identification, us versus them thinking. This involves practices like daily silence or meditation, self-study, understanding our own patterns, healing personal and collective trauma, consciously releasing false identities we cling to, and actively practicing humility and forgiveness in daily life. It also requires breaking old systems, but through peaceful disobedience to falsehood. This means consciously saying no to participating in things we know are wrong, maybe refusing exploitative jobs, rejecting divisive political rhetoric, challenging dehumanizing beliefs, choosing not to consume things that harm the earth or other beings. It's about non-participation in illusion, described as a peaceful revolt of integrity. Preparation also crucially means building new communities. The transition doesn't happen in isolation. It happens through networks of awakened individuals connecting and collaborating. This involves forming local Kalkiist study circles or similar groups focused on these principles, maybe starting community gardens to share food, sharing tools and skills, creating alternative education hubs, using digital platforms for connection, awareness building, and organizing. These small communities act as living prototypes of the world to come, demonstrating the principles in practice. The source also emphasizes honoring time, but not waiting. The Satya Yuga won't just appear fully formed overnight, it's a gradual dawning. But the preparation, the inner and outer work, must begin now. Every truthful conversation, every act of compassion, every awakened soul adds light to the planet and accelerates the transition. The source then points to what it sees as clear signs that the shift has already begun. On the one hand, the visible crumbling of old institutions, religions losing credibility, governments losing trust, economies facing recurring crises, but also, positively, the rise of conscious movements, everything from the boom in meditation apps and wellness practices to decentralized technologies challenging old power structures, climate justice protests demanding systemic change. Millions of people are waking up, forming what the source calls a bridge generation. And the greatest sign, it states unequivocally, is the presence of the world teacher, Lord Kalki. Claiming he has already spoken, written, clarified prophecy, offered the roadmap, the manifesto, and thereby activated the transition consciously. His presence, from this perspective, means the new age isn't just a distant possibility anymore. It's an unfolding inevitability, which we must now consciously choose to live into. Finally, the source outlines very clearly what the Satya Yuga asks of you, the individual listening. It asks for courage, the courage to question everything, to walk away from comfortable falsehoods, to speak truth even when it's unpopular. It asks for purity, not impossible perfection, but conscious intentionality, striving to align thoughts, words, and actions with our highest values. It asks for service, recognizing that the Satya Yuga is built by selfless servants of the world, those who feed the hungry, teach the young, heal the wounded, liberate the oppressed, even love their enemies. And it asks for vision, the ability to hold the image of this new world clearly in our minds and hearts, a world without poverty, borders, or needless noise, a planet of awakened beings, and then, crucially, to get busy building it.
The scale of this transformation is just immense, isn't it? But the message seems so clear. The path to peace, a true and lasting peace, is here. It's structured. And it demands our active participation, starting right now, within ourselves and in the world. This sounds like a peace genuinely worth pursuing, as the source insists.
Yes, and Chapter 12 really contrasts the kind of peace we might know now with the peace Kalki offers. It describes the false peace of the Kali Yuga, often a pax through power, like the Pax Romana or Pax Americana. This isn't true peace, it argues, but merely enforced silence, suppression of dissent, a stability based on fear. It also critiques peace as profit, where diplomatic deals are driven by economic interests, weapons are sold to maintain a balance of power, and reconstruction contracts follow wars. This is described as just managed tension, profitable, polluting, and profoundly unstable. And critically, this false peace is marked by the absence of a shared vision, a lack of collective commitment to a fundamentally higher, more ethical way of being. Treaties fail because the underlying consciousness hasn't shifted. In stark contrast, the peace Kalki offers is described as a peace built on dharma, on cosmic rightness, truth, and harmony. This peace isn't enforced from the top down, it's chosen from the bottom up because it's recognized as truthful, beneficial, and ultimately joyful. It naturally emerges when economies are designed to serve all, when governments become transparent and wise, when resources are shared equitably, when education elevates consciousness, and when spirituality unites rather than divides. It requires a global ethic without dogma. Not converting everyone to one religion, but converging on core universal values found in all traditions. Reverence for all life, radical truthfulness, compassion, justice, mutual respect. It also requires structural peace. This means actively dismantling war economies, repurposing military resources and personnel for constructive projects, gradually dissolving borders through mutual cooperation and trust, and forming global councils based on wisdom, not just national interest. Technology, governed by compassion and consciousness, can facilitate much of this structural change. This vision hinges fundamentally on shifting from competition to coordination, moving away from the zero-sum game mentality where one nation's rise must mean another's fall, recognizing that for truly global challenges like climate change, pandemics, AI ethics, mass migration, cooperation isn't just nice, it's essential for survival. The source proposes a kind of united planet model, maybe a Council of Elders visionaries offering ethical guidance, AI-assisted democratic platforms for global decision-making on shared issues, mechanisms for sharing resources fairly, while still maintaining local autonomy within a framework of planetary unity. It also emphasizes cross-cultural awakening. True peace isn't about homogenization, it's about each culture contributing its unique wisdom to the whole. Indigenous traditions, Eastern spiritual practices, African philosophies, the core ethical teachings of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, all have vital roles to play. Peace is envisioned as a beautiful symphony, not a monotone. And finally, it comes back to the role of you and me. Peace isn't passive. It's not something we just wait for leaders to deliver. It requires our active participation in building a just, compassionate world right where we are. You don't need to wait for governments. You can work to de-escalate conflicts in your own life, support local peace initiatives, consciously choose to spread the Kalkiist Manifesto and its ideas, build bridges between different spiritual or cultural groups, and diligently cultivate inner peace through personal practice. It's a direct call to practice the peace you preach, to actually be the change you want to see in the world. It invites listeners to join the Global Peace Network, perhaps by forming Kalkiist circles, building small-scale communities, experimenting with gift economies, creating interfaith sanctuaries for dialogue, developing post-capitalist digital tools, taking concrete action. The final section, What Peace Makes Possible, paints a truly inspiring picture. It talks about the flowering of human potential, once fear and survival cease to dominate, an explosion in creativity, art, science, and inner exploration. It describes the healing of the planet as forests regrow, oceans become clean again, and humanity transitions into being a responsible caretaker species. And crucially, it points towards the expansion of consciousness itself, the possibility of deeper states of meditation becoming commonplace, perhaps even developing latent abilities like telepathic empathy, and ultimately the widespread embodiment of our inherent divine nature. This peace, the peace Lord Kalki supposedly came to usher in, is presented as not just peace among nations, but ultimately union with the infinite.
That is a truly radical, almost staggering vision for our shared future. But as we've heard, one that our source insists is not just a distant dream, but a practical, achievable plan if we choose it. The scale of this transformation is immense, absolutely, but the message seems incredibly clear. The path to peace is here, it is structured, and it demands our active participation, starting right now. So our deep dive today into the last age of war, the first age of peace, has really taken us on quite a profound journey, hasn't it? We started by looking at those intense geopolitical tensions, particularly in the Middle East, that crucible of conflict and revelation. We saw how ancient prophecies like the Red Heifer are literally fueling modern ambitions for things like a third temple, creating this potential flashpoint for truly global crisis.
Right. And then we really tried to reimagine the whole concept of end times, moving beyond that Hollywood-driven idea of cataclysm to understand it more as the end of an age, specifically the Dark Age, the Kali Yuga, and the simultaneous birth of the Satya Yuga, an age of truth and fundamental transformation. That perspective really shifts prophecy from being just a script of doom to being more like a guide for conscious action.
And we challenged that feeling of inevitability, didn't we? Seeing that war doesn't actually have to happen, history shows us examples where even the gravest conflicts were averted through conscious choice, leadership, and a real commitment to peace. Which then led us to that truly paradigm-shifting idea that the universal Messiah figure, sought across Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, might in fact be one and the same figure, Lord Kalki, who our source claims is already here among us.
Exactly. Lord Kalki, presented as the avatar for this new age, not as a myth, but as a living guide whose symbolic sword of knowledge is meant to cut through illusion and falsehood. And his primary gift to humanity, according to the source, is the Kalkiist Manifesto, that radical yet practical roadmap for global redemption, a blueprint for a cashless, interest-free economy, the eventual end of nation-states, and a post-religious, universal spiritual civilization.
But then, we had to confront that really unsettling paradox. If this path to peace is supposedly so clear, so logical, why is there generally such a deafening silence from the world about it? A silence apparently born from our collective addiction to conflict, from the powerful industrial complex of war and religion, and maybe from a collective failure of imagination, a failure to truly envision a different future. A silence that comes, potentially, at a profound cost.
Yet despite all that, the source ends on a powerful note of hope, a call to prepare ourselves for the Satya Yuga, the age of truth that it insists is already dawning, regardless of the resistance. It describes what this age looks like and offers practical ways we can prepare ourselves inwardly and outwardly. How we can join in building a peace that isn't just the absence of war, but a complete Dharma-based restructuring of global cooperation, a peace worth pursuing.
So perhaps the takeaway is this. You, dear listener, you're no longer just a passive observer watching history unfold. You are potentially a participant in destiny itself. The war, the conflict is optional. But this peace, this transformation towards truth, perhaps that peace is inevitable in the long run. This deep dive into the last age of war, the first age of peace, has laid out a powerful, challenging framework. Now, the real question isn't just what will happen, but maybe what will you do now that you know this perspective exists? Will you share this message, these ideas, with people you care about? Will you take the time to study the manifesto for yourself to see if it resonates? Will you begin to prepare yourself inwardly for the coming age, consciously letting go of old fears, old divisions? Will you choose to stand for truth, even and especially when it is inconvenient? The dawn of the Satya Yuga, according to this source, begins not with a bang, but with our individual and collective choices, starting right now.